Summer of 2010. The air hung thick and heavy over our little town, the kind of heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and the cicadas drone relentlessly. My family, my parents and my younger sister, lived in a house perched on a slight hill, just at the very edge of town. It was an older place, maybe 20-odd years, nothing fancy, but it was ours. A bit of a drive from the center, and the nearest neighbors were a decent stretch away, but it was quiet, spacious, and the hillside location meant we always had a pleasant breeze rustling through the trees. I loved it there. It felt like our own secluded little world. That summer was particularly peaceful. Long, lazy days melting into equally languid evenings. We'd have barbecues on the back porch, the scent of charring meat mingling with the sweet honeysuckle that climbed the trellis. Evenings were spent playing board games under the soft glow of the porch light, the sounds of crickets our constant companions. It was the kind of summer you wish would never end. Then came the weekend my grandparents on my dad's side wanted us to visit. It wasn't a long drive, a couple of hours at most, and usually I looked forward to seeing them. But that particular Saturday I was wrestling with a looming deadline for a summer school assignment. Something about the symbolism in Moby Dick, if I remember correctly. The very thought of spending the day making small talk while Ahab and his white whale swam circles in my brain wasn't appealing. So, I made my excuses. I told my parents I was too close to finishing my paper, that a day away would break my concentration. They weren't thrilled, my mom especially, giving me that pointed look that said, "Family time is important, Henry." But ultimately they relented. My sister, ever the social butterfly, was already practically bouncing with excitement at the prospect of Grandma's apple pie. And then there was Coco, our scruffy mutt of a dog, a rescue with one ear that perpetually flopped over and eyes that held an endless well of goofy affection. Coco was family through and through. He usually went everywhere with us, especially on car rides, where he'd happily wedge himself between my sister and me in the back seat, occasionally letting out a contented sigh. But this time my mom, ever mindful of the car's cleanliness, decided Coco should stay home too. "It'll be too hot for him in the car all day," she reasoned, and honestly I was secretly relieved to have his company. So there I was, standing on the porch, waving goodbye as the family car pulled down the driveway and disappeared around the bend in the road. The familiar rumble of the engine faded into the quiet hum of the summer afternoon. A strange sort of stillness settled over the house the moment they were gone. It was a silence different from the usual peaceful quiet. This had an edge to it, a feeling of absence. I stepped back inside, the screen door clicking shut behind me. The house felt immediately different, larger somehow. The warmth that usually permeated the air, a byproduct of family activity and shared spaces, seemed to have dissipated, leaving a slightly cooler, almost empty feeling. Coco padded up to me, his tail giving a tentative wag. He seemed to sense the shift too. The house, usually bustling with the sounds of footsteps, laughter, and the clatter of daily life, was now eerily silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed amplified, each tick a deliberate beat in the sudden vacuum of sound. The very air felt heavier, less breathable. It was just me and Coco now in a house that suddenly felt far too big for two. The afternoon stretched before me, an expanse of quietude that, for the first time, felt less like peace and more like waiting. Waiting for something to fill the silence. And in the back of my mind, a tiny seed of unease began to sprout. This solitude, which I had initially welcomed, now carried a faint, unsettling whisper. The stillness had settled, and with it, a prickle of something I couldn't quite name. Yet, the initial novelty of having the house to myself wore off quickly. I tried to focus on my paper, but the silence was a persistent distraction. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the window sounded amplified in the stillness. Coco, usually content to nap at my feet while I worked, was restless. He'd lift his head suddenly, his ears twitching, and stare intently at seemingly empty corners of the room. Sometimes a low growl would rumble in his chest, a sound that had no apparent source, as dusk began to paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The feeling of unease intensified. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to writhe in my peripheral vision. Coco became increasingly agitated. He'd follow me from room to room, his tail tucked low, his large brown eyes wide with what I could only interpret as fear. Then came the night. The house groaned and settled as the temperature dropped, the familiar sounds of an old building. But Coco's behavior took a turn for the truly unsettling. He started barking at nothing. He'd stand in the middle of the living room, his gaze fixed on an empty space near the hallway, and unleash a series of frantic barks. His hackles raised. When I'd try to soothe him, he'd ignore me, his focus entirely consumed by whatever he perceived in the darkness. It happened again and again throughout the evening. He'd be lying calmly at my feet, then suddenly bolt upright, staring into the void, barking as if confronting an unseen intruder. I checked every room, every closet, convinced there must be a stray animal or some other logical explanation. But there was never anything there, just empty space and Coco's palpable terror. His fear became contagious. The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss it as just a dog being a dog, perhaps sensing something I couldn't. But the sheer intensity of his reactions, the way his body would tremble, the raw fear in his eyes, it chipped away at my skepticism. Days turned into nights and Coco's fear escalated. He became increasingly clingy, refusing to leave my side. He'd whine and scratch at the bedroom door if I left him alone, even for a few minutes. He stopped eating properly, his once enthusiastic greetings replaced with nervous tail wags and anxious glances around the room. I took him to the vet, a kindly old woman who'd known Coco since he was a puppy. She ran a battery of tests, but everything came back normal. "He's perfectly healthy physically, Henry," she said, her brow furrowed. "Sometimes animals can sense things we can't. Has anything unusual been happening at home?" I hesitated, feeling foolish even considering it. "Not really," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just some odd behavior. Maybe he's just getting older?" The vet gave me a knowing look. "Keep an eye on him," she advised. "And trust your gut, Henry. Animals are more attuned to their surroundings than we give them credit for." I left the vet's office feeling no better than when I arrived. Coco's fear was a tangible presence in the house now, a constant reminder that something felt profoundly wrong. The darkness in the corners seemed darker, the silence heavier. And in the dead of night, when Coco would suddenly start barking at the unseen, a cold knot of dread would tighten in my stomach. Something was in the dark with us. I didn't know what it was, but its presence was growing stronger, more insistent. The cheerful voices of my parents on the phone were a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere in the house. I'd called them a few days after their visit started, trying to sound casual as I mentioned Coco's strange behavior. They'd chuckled, suggesting he was probably just missing them or perhaps had sensed a squirrel in the attic. Their lightheartedness only amplified my growing unease. The normalcy on their end felt like a different reality altogether. I was sitting in the living room, Coco nestled nervously at my feet, the phone resting on my lap as I talked to my mom. Even Coco seemed a little calmer with the sound of familiar voices. We were chatting about the weather at their place, the surprisingly good hand of poker my dad had played when the internet connection suddenly dropped. The movie I had been half watching on my laptop froze, the screen displaying a pixelated image. "Hold on, Mom, I think the internet just went out," I said, glancing at the modem. The lights were all dead. Coco immediately tensed up. He whined softly, then fixed his gaze on the power outlet where the modem was plugged in. His low growl returned, more insistent this time. He watched the empty socket as if expecting something to emerge from it. He wouldn't let me go near it, whimpering and nudging my leg with his nose, pulling me away from the wall. The phone line went dead a moment later. Silence descended again, thicker and more suffocating than before. The connection to the outside world had been severed. A prickle of genuine fear ran down my spine. It wasn't just a technical glitch. It felt deliberate. Strange occurrences began to multiply. Objects would shift slightly on shelves. Doors that I was sure I had closed would be ajar the next time I looked. The temperature in certain rooms would plummet inexplicably, even on the warm summer days. The air would sometimes carry a faint metallic scent, gone as quickly as it appeared. But the most disturbing thing was the shadows. I started noticing them more and more. Not just the regular shadows cast by furniture and the setting sun. These were different. They seemed fluid. In the corners of my eyes, I'd catch glimpses of movement, of shapes that seemed to writhe and expand in the dim light. When I turned to look directly, they'd be gone, melting back into the normal darkness. The house felt like it was breathing, the shadows like dark lungs expanding and contracting. The light fixtures in the house started failing one by one. A bulb would flicker and die, plunging a room into deeper gloom. It started with the hallway light, then the one in the kitchen, then the lamp in the living room. Each burnt-out bulb felt like another step deeper into an encroaching darkness. One evening I was standing in the hallway, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows through the windows. Coco was whimpering behind me, pressed tightly against my legs. As I looked down the hallway towards the living room, I saw it. A shape in the deeper shadow near the doorway. It was low to the ground, elongated, and it seemed to be moving. Not walking, but crawling, a slow, deliberate slither across the floor where no shadow should have been. My breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't a trick of the light. This was something solid, something dark and malevolent taking form in the absence of light. It moved with a disturbing fluidity like liquid night given a terrifying semblance of life. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence. I stared, frozen in terror, unable to look away as the crawling darkness continued its silent, horrifying progress across my home. It was then, in that moment of utter dread, that I understood. We weren't alone. And whatever was here wasn't just in the dark. It was the dark, taking shape, growing stronger. And it was in my house. The memory of seeing that thing crawl across my living room floor is seared into my mind. Sleep offered no escape, only nightmares filled with writhing shadows and Coco's terrified whimpers echoing in the darkness. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I had to get out, or at least find some answers. Then I remembered the cellar. It was an old, musty space beneath the house, mostly used for storage. My dad had always warned us kids to stay away from it, citing its unstable stone walls and the dampness. There was a small, unassuming wooden door in the back of the pantry that led down a narrow flight of creaking stairs. I had always been curious about it, but had never dared to disobey my dad's instructions. Now, with the unsettling activity escalating and the palpable sense of something evil in the house, the cellar felt like the only place I hadn't fully explored, the only potential source of whatever was plaguing us. I made my way to the pantry, my hand trembling as I reached for the door handle. Coco whined anxiously, nudging my hand with his wet nose, trying to pull me away. He seemed to sense the danger, his fear a mirror of my own growing dread. I pulled the door open, revealing the dark, descending staircase. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else. Something earthy and unsettlingly sweet. "It's okay, boy," I whispered to Coco, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Just going to take a quick look." But as I started to descend the stairs, Coco's whimpers turned into frantic barks. He lunged forward, nipping at my ankle, a clear warning. He planted his feet, refusing to let me go down. I hesitated. Coco's fear was primal, visceral. Maybe I should wait for my parents to come home. But then a strange compulsion washed over me, an almost physical pull towards the darkness below. It felt like something was calling me down there, drawing me into the depths of the house. Before I could fully process the thought, my foot slipped on the worn wooden step. I stumbled downwards, and the heavy cellar door swung shut behind me with a resounding thud, plunging me into absolute darkness. I fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. Panic surged through me, cold and sharp. Upstairs, I could hear Coco's frantic barking and scratching at the door, a desperate attempt to reach me. "Coco, it's okay, I'm fine," I yelled, but my voice felt swallowed by the thick, damp air. Alone in the pitch black, a chilling realization washed over me. I was trapped. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled in my pocket for my phone. The screen flickered to life, offering a weak, inadequate light source in the oppressive darkness. The cellar was colder and damper than I had imagined, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. The stone walls were slick with moisture, and the ground beneath my feet felt uneven and soft. I swept the weak beam of my phone's flashlight around the small space. Dust motes danced in the meager light, revealing stacks of forgotten boxes and discarded furniture draped in cobwebs. I tried the door handle again, pushing and pulling with all my strength, but it remained stubbornly locked. Terror began to gnaw at the edges of my composure. I tried to reason with myself, to find a logical explanation for everything that had happened. But the crawling shadow, the feeling of being watched, Coco's relentless fear, it all pointed to something beyond the rational. As I ventured deeper into the cellar, the flashlight beam seemed to diminish, the darkness swallowing the light as if it had a physical presence. I called out for Coco, for anyone, but only the echo of my own voice answered. Then I saw it, a fleeting movement in the periphery of my light, a dark shape scurrying behind a stack of old boxes. I whipped the light towards it, but it was gone. My breath hitched. Something was down here with me. The sounds started soon after. Soft, rustling noises coming from the shadows. The distinct sound of something dragging itself across the damp earth floor. I swung the flashlight around wildly, catching glimpses of movement, dark shapes that recoiled from the light, disappearing back into the oppressive blackness. They were small, low to the ground, and they moved with a disturbing insect-like quickness. I stumbled blindly through the darkness, the rustling sounds growing closer, more insistent. It felt like the very earth around me was alive, teeming with unseen creatures that feared the light but were emboldened by the darkness. Then the flashlight in my hand flickered and died, plunging me into absolute suffocating darkness. The silence that followed was broken only by the frantic pounding of my own heart and the faint but unmistakable sounds of skittering and scratching all around me. Despair washed over me, cold and heavy as the cellar air. Without the light, my senses became hyperacute. Every slight breeze that whispered past my ear sounded like a sinister murmur. The faint scratching sounds intensified, becoming a chaotic chorus that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, as if something was trying to claw its way out of the very ground beneath my feet. Suddenly, I was shoved from the side by something small and furry. I cried out in terror, falling to the damp earth. But then a familiar bark pierced the darkness, a sound of pure relief. It wasn't something sinister. It was Coco. How he had gotten down here, I had no idea. But there he was, his warm, solid presence a beacon in the overwhelming darkness. I could feel him nudging me, and then a sharp tug on my jeans. He was biting my pant leg, trying to pull me in a particular direction. Blindly, I followed the tug, trusting Coco's instincts. He led me through the darkness, past unseen obstacles, his frantic whimpers my only guide. Then I felt a rush of cooler air, a faint hint of the outside world. Coco was pulling me towards a small opening in the stone foundation, a rough-hewn hole just large enough to squeeze through. With Coco's persistent pulling and my own desperate scrambling, I managed to wriggle through the hole and tumble out into the relative safety of the overgrown backyard. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the house, Coco panting by my side. We didn't go back inside that night. We waited in the woods until the first rays of dawn painted the sky, the memory of the darkness and the unseen creatures in the cellar a chilling weight in my mind. We never spoke of what might have been in that cellar, whether it was something supernatural or just my overactive imagination fueled by fear and Coco's strange behavior. I'll never truly know. But when my parents returned, their relief at finding me unharmed was palpable. We boarded up the cellar door and eventually filled in the outside access point, a silent agreement to bury whatever secrets lay beneath our home. Even now, years later, I still get a shiver down my spine when I think about the darkness in that house, the feeling of being utterly alone with something unknown. But as long as I'm not by myself, and especially if I have a loyal companion by my side, well, the darkness doesn't seem quite so menacing anymore. But I'll never forget that summer. The summer the stillness in our home held a terrifying secret in its shadows. And I'll always be grateful for the scruffy mutt named Coco, who might have very well saved my life from whatever lurked beneath our peaceful hillside home.